In this lesson, we'll take a look at how the MIA round corners node can be used to add a beveled appearance to our rendered objects. So here's the scene file that we're going to start with. Now let's take a quick render at what we have to begin with, and let's just see where we're starting from. Now you'll notice that our geometry has a lot of these really sharp corners. You'll notice that there is no beveling whatsoever happening in any of these areas. So let's take a look at how the round corners node can be used to fix that. So let's take a look inside the hypershade. Now this MIA round corners node, since it is a node with this MIA prefix, that means it's only going to be compatible with these other architectural nodes. So in our case, this needs to be plugged into either an MIA material X or an MIA material, or anything with the MIA prefix. So let's take this round corners node, and in my case I'm using the MIA material X, which means that we do have a couple of different bumping methods that are available to us. So we can really use this MIA round corners node in any one of these bump map slots, and that's really where this is meant to go. So let's choose one of these. In our case, we can just use the standard. So now that this is plugged in, let's take another render. I'll save this one for comparison. Now when we first render, we shouldn't see any difference at all. And that's because we have not right now defined any sort of a radius for this rounding to occur at. So right now with this set to 0, we won't see any effect. Let's go ahead and lower this radius to something like 0.2. Now what this should start to do is start to give us sort of a beveled appearance of roughly 0.2 units in world space. And you can really see how that's eliminated a lot of the hard edges that we had before, if you compare what we had before to what we have now. Now it's important to note that the MIA round corners node is not actually physically altering the geometry in any way. Really, this is just a simple little normals trick, similar to the way in which a bump map works. All it does is take these very hardened normals around these edges and softens those at render time. So that's why this needs to be plugged into the bump mapping slot, because really it just uses the exact same procedure. So let's lower this radius a little bit further, something like 0.05. And now you can really start to see that very clear beveling effect that we have. Now because this is just a simple normals trick, this is a node that does have a tendency to break if the actual angle or the radius is set too far. So if we were to really increase this to something like 0.7, now we actually should start to see this effect really break. And you can see now that's exactly what we get. This radius value is just too high in order to cleanly and accurately start to round out these corners. So this is, however, a unit that is based on world space measurements. So depending on the size of your object in the scene, you may have to increase this value higher or lower. Let's go ahead and select the actual view here. And now you can start to see, again, how that starts to clean up and bevel out these edges. Now one of the areas that you'll notice we actually do have a slight problem with is right in here. You'll notice that it does do a good job of beveling these corners outward, or beveling them in, but any of these pieces of geometry that are actually touching each other, anything that uses this MIA material will try to bevel into itself. So another situation where we can see that, or another area where we should be able to really see that, is right in here. So you can see that these are two completely separate pieces of geometry that are not joined together in any way. But because they do have such a high angle between them, and because both of these pieces of geometry are using the MIA material, it will at render time try to soften out the normals right between these two. And you can really start to see where that effect starts to happen. So it really does kind of give this more the appearance of being one single joined piece of geometry. So in order to fix that, if we, for whatever reason, don't want that kind of a situation, all we have to do is drop in another MIA material. We can select the pieces of geometry that we want to have this different shader. Let's say we want these two. And now just take our new MIA material and assign it to those two objects. Now because this is just a simple node, we can actually share this between these two different actual materials. So let's just take this and we'll connect it into the standard bump as well. And you can now see how these two pieces of geometry are no longer blending into any other parts of this machine. So really this is what the renderer will use as a method for determining the separation point for different objects, is whether or not they are sharing the same material, even though they are sharing the same rounded corners node. Now we do have the option to change that, however, is if we go back to the round corners node and turn on this allow different materials. Now what this will do is, instead of using the materials as a basis for separating these beveling effects, is it will now ignore those, and even though these two objects are using different materials, it will still try to blend between those. So you can see what we had before and what we have now. So that's a look at how we can use this rounded corners node as a way of giving our geometry a beveled appearance without having to go through the process of manually beveling every piece of geometry.